Hello and welcome to Fly Tying Sessions with me, Alex Jardine, and today we're going to be looking at spring trout fishing nymphs. With spring just around the corner, I thought this would be a great topic for us to explore in this video, and we're going to look at 5 nymphs that have done me very well throughout the years, both in the UK, which is where I predominantly spend my fishing time, but also in locations all over the world. And whilst I refer to these as spring nymphs, they certainly go on the end of my line all the way through the trout season. So definitely one or two here that you should look to emulate in your own fishing, I would say, and you probably have one or two of them in your box already. So fly number 1 this evening, we're going to do the hare's ear, one that's been done over and over again through the generations, and just a terrific all-round nymph pattern. It can represent almost anything, and the trout seem to absolutely love it. So hook-wise, we've got the Partridge SLD2 in a size 14 here. You can tie these from a size 10 through to 20s and beyond if you want. Bead, we've got a countersunk tungsten bead in copper. Again, you can vary bead colour. You can have some bright coloured beads for dirty water. Gold bead was the traditional colour, but varying it. I quite like copper for my trout nymphs in particular, and I know that it's a very popular one amongst New Zealand fishermen who refer to this type of fly as the Hare and copper. Thread, we're going to use the Semperfli Nano Silk in black, 18.0. The thread does very little in this fly apart from provide us the basis for strapping the materials, so we're not looking to add colour or bulk with it. So use your sort of best underbody thread, which I find is this Nano Silk. So I start it behind the bead and begin to take it down the shank, and just before you get to the end of the straight part, nip out that tag end, place one more turn just to trap down any loose ends, and then we're going to strap in our tail. So the tail for this, you can use hare's ear and use some of the guard fibres to create your tail. That will give you a nice bulky tail. If you're looking for a thinner tail, then you can go down the realms of using Cote de Lion, which we'll be using a lot in other flies. But personally, I quite like to use English partridge. You get a lovely barring effect on there, and it's a slightly thicker fibre, offers a bit more movement than Cote de Lion as well. So I like it for this particular fly. And we're going to take a good half dozen fibres, try and keep them so the tips are more or less in line, and then I keep my tails quite short with this, so probably around about half the body length, and we'll secure that in. If you want it a little bit longer, you can pull it back before you put in your locking turns. And there you go, very simply we've got the tail in place, all secured on top of the shank of the hook, and then take our thread towards the bead just to strap down any of those loose fibres. And then we want to introduce our rib at this point. So here we're going to put in a gold rib, 0.2mm, and that's there as a bit of a sighter, but to also add some segmentation to our fly. And we can use our thumbnail to snap the wires so we're not cutting it. And then to tie it in, push it inside the bead, and I do it on my side of the shank, and allow the thread to catch, and then work your thread touching turns. I mean, they can be a bit open if you want, because it's all going to be hidden by the body, but with a good amount of pressure so the wire's not going to slip all the way to your tail section. And now we're going to enter the body part, so the element that gives it its name of hare's ear. For some, the easiest way is to buy pre-mixed hare's ear blends. There's plenty of good ones out there. I like to mix my own because I like a bit more guard hair in there. I've already mixed this. I'm hoping to do a separate video at some point on how to mix the hare's ear in a bit more detail. But essentially you want a good mix of guard hairs and underfur, so it's all blended in together. The underfur will give you your nice binding to the thread, whereas the guard hairs will give you this sort of pokey, buggy effect on the fly where they'll stick out. The guard hairs on their own don't dub very well, whereas the underfur dubs a little too well. So you want that blend of both to give you the best looking fly. So take your hare's ear and just get it so it's attached to the thread, and then begin to tighten at the top and then work down through the bulk of your dubbing. This section here isn't wound too tightly at the point. We just want to focus on that being the tightly wound bit, because we need to lock that in. That turn has now locked in everything, and we can begin to tighten everything else up. For the body, we can keep it quite tightly wound. We don't need too many spiky guard hairs at this point. We're going to focus that mainly in the thorax area, but we're looking to build a taper. So you want your dubbing to either get thicker, or you want to wind up and then wind back on itself to help give you that bulk. And now you'll see some of those guard hairs beginning to spike out. That's perfect. I've left a little bit of room at the thorax area. I'm going to finish that off in a second, but at this point we're going to bring our rib through, and I wind with the dubbing so I don't trap too many of those guard hairs, whereas if I wound against the dubbing I would trap a lot more of those guard hairs. And bring it round all the way up, just segments that are gently opening up as they go. Take our thread over the wire and in front, and then to remove the wire, twist it on the shank of the hook until it will snap itself clean off. So that's our body area, and now we just need to add the thorax. What you can do at this part, if you know you're fishing in coloured water or water that remains teed stained quite a lot of the time, you can add a little hot spot in at this point. But just for a bog standard hare's ear, we're going to take the same dubbing again. This time we want to make sure that there's a good amount of guard hair, and the trick with this section is not to dub it on too tightly. So you will lose some dubbing as you wind, but just keep winding through and you'll see some of the guard hairs beginning to really spike out now. And you see that's all because we haven't wound them too tightly against the thread. And it's now giving us a really good profile where the legs of the nymph would be. So it'll give us lots of movement. It looks really realistic in the water. And we want to keep adding dubbing until we can't really turn that bead anymore. And then we'll put in a few thread turns that will lock the bead in place. So if you can still turn that bead with ease, you haven't put enough material on the fly. So just bear that in mind if you find that your bead's spinning round, because you can find that your flies will fall apart if they're not done properly. So there we have it, the really leggy thorax area, slightly tighter wound body, and that partridge tail. And really simple fly, but a great spring pattern when fish might be feeding on shrimp, waterlouts, but they'll also take it for various baetis and caddis that might be swimming around or breaking or sort of slipping loose in the water. So it is an all things to all trout, so you can't really go without this on. And just nip the thread out. Right. So keeping with the traditional theme, for fly number 2 of the video, we're going to look at the pheasant tail nymph. Like the hare's ear, it is just a general all-purpose nymph, works nearly in all water types, all occasions. It can be adapted to different situations if needs be. And for this particular fly, going to change threads and go with the Semperfli orange waxed thread in a 12-0. So a little bit thicker than the normal nano silk that I would use, but this I'm going to look to use it to add a bit of colour to the fly towards the end. So start the thread and you can nip the tag out quite early on in this one, and this is sort of the key stage of the fly, because how you work this stage of the fly will affect the entire fly. It's not like a dubbed body. Everything you do is going towards the profile of the fly. So we're going to add our tail at this point, which is now our wonderful Coq de Leon. Really long, slender but quite stiff fibres. These are perfect tailing fibres, and we're going to look to take, I'm quite particular, we're going to look to take 4, whereas most of the flies that we're representing will have 2 or 3 tails, but 4 always seems to give the fly good profile. And we want to again make sure those tips are all in line. And we're now looking for about the body length for the tail on this one. So hold the tail against the shank, bring the thread up through it and make a loop, and then if it doesn't get stuck to your nail, that loop will slide down on top of the shank there. So put that off a little, got it a bit short that time, there we go. And keeping them all on top of the shank here, take them all the way up to the bead until it's round in the bead, and then to help create the profile of this fly I will double back the fibres and wind them halfway down and then cut them out at that point. That's creating more bulk towards the bead and less towards the back. Take it a few turns further, probably 3/4 of the way back, and now we're going to place more or less touching turns to the bead, back not quite all the way that we've just gone, halfway now, back up to the bead, and then halfway again on that and back up to the bead. So this is now creating a sort of carrot shape to the fly, at which point we can now add in our rib. This time we're using a copper wire in 0.2mm, and we can break that off and poke the wire inside the bead and trap it in on our side, so the fly hard side of the shank, and then keep it there by running close touching turns all the way down to where the tail begins. And now we're going to enter our body material, which is the pheasant tail. This is what gives the fly its name, and generally I'll look to tie in 3 fibres. That's always a good amount to cover most body lengths. If you're tying these in really small, like 18s and 20s, you'll only need 2. Otherwise 3 can create a little bit of bulk at that size. So now you want to get the tips of the fibres together, put that against the shank of the hook, try and keep them together and just trap those in, and just wind those down going forward, trapping them in as you go. And now we're going to begin to wind it. So bring it forward, try not to put too much pressure on that first wind, so give it direction with your tying hand, and then take your off hand and use that to just ease it round the shank of the hook. And now we're going to just make sure they're all together so they don't split and give us too much thread coming through there. And we're going to ease it round again. And now touching turns going forward, we don't want them to overlap, otherwise that will create a bulky section. And just keep touching turns all the way going forward. And then once we get roughly a bead width from the bead, we can trap those off with 2 turns behind, a couple of turns in front, and then just trim that out with our scissors. And now with the rib, we want to go against the grain of the pheasant tail, so the opposite direction that we just wound. That will help bind it all down. It means when a toothy trout comes along that the whole fly doesn't get shredded and fall apart. So nice easy segmentations that are just gently opening up as you go. And when you get to the final one, take your thread across and in front, and then use that twisting style just to ease it out at the part where you've tied it off. Sometimes it just takes a bit longer, particularly the thicker the wire you use. There we go. And then we're going to build up our thorax area now. For this, just going to use a simple hare's ear blend. So again, this is one that I've mixed myself. We're looking for plenty of guard hairs to give you that leggy thorax area. Bind that on, not too tightly so we know that it's going to grab and spit out some of those guard hairs. So that's quite a nice coverage there. And now this is where the orange thread comes into its own. So I'm going to put in lots of thread turns now. So I'm looking to get this thread showing up between the thorax and the bead, and that could be a really good little trigger for fish, particularly if they're being a little bit fussy. Just a little glow of orange can sometimes be enough to set them off. Now we can go in with the whip finish and tighten that all down, and with the scissors just nip that out. If you want to, you can put a touch of glue on. I don't, but everyone's slightly different. I don't like to put glue in because you can sometimes catch these guard hairs, but if you want your fly to last a little bit longer, it can be a good thing to do. Right, moving on to fly number 3, we're going to tie the perfect quill nymph. Again, this is another bead-headed style of nymph, designed really to get down but also look quite imitative. So hook-wise, we've got the Partridge SLD2, this is a size 14. Again, you can tie these maybe 12 through to 18. They can get a little bit fiddly once you go into 20s and beyond, but if you're tying them, we're going to be using Perfect Quill by Semperfli for the body. If you're tying it with stripped pheasant quill, then you can go down to even smaller sizes if you want to. So, bead, we've got a countersunk black nickel bead. This is a 3mm, one on the size 14, so we want the fly to get down relatively quickly. Thread, we've got the Semperfli wax thread in pale olive 12/0, and as with most beaded flies, we're just going to begin just behind the bead there, and we can nip that tag out. Taking our thread down now, we're going to look to add the tail early on here, if I can find my Cote de Lion feather. So again, that wonderful barred Cote de Lion fibre for the tail here. Take my 4 fibres and nip them out. And we're looking for the body length for a tail. So take our thread up, throw that loop and slide it down on top of the hook. That will help hold everything in position. You can, if you notice it's slightly out, you can ease it in with your thumbnail and then wind that all the way up to the bead and then back on itself halfway down the shank, and then nip those tads out for a couple more turns back, and we're now creating that carrot profile again by doing touch and turns and going back different lengths each time, because that most of the flies we're representing have that small body where the tail starts, but then get quite bulky towards the front, which is where the strength of the nymph is, in order to allow it to swim in the fast river currents. And then we've got our olive Perfect Quill by Semperfli. This is small and it's a adhesive rubberized material, slightly clear. It's got a dark side and a light side, and it's got an olive effect to it, but the reason I use the pale olive thread is to allow the bits that aren't coloured darkly to shine through with olive. You can use different colours if you want to give a different effect, but trap that in with the small end first and wind it in as much as possible, going forward all the way to where you'll be working your thorax later. And now you want to start winding, and you're looking to not take your tail too much round. You're looking to give yourself touching turns as you go. The adhesive nature of the material will help just bind to your thread as you wind. If you find it's too dark, you can open some of those turns out. That's the joy of using that olivey thread. Until you're at the front there. And one of the benefits of using a material like this is it's not going to hold your fly up from sinking. So if you need to get your fly down to the fish quickly, this will get you there. So we've got that in. At this point, what you can do is take some UV glue and just add it in. Hopefully it will start to come out in a second. Put a glob on the top there. Take a needle and just dab it round. A, makes it more resilient, and B, just helps add a little bit extra to the fly. Pop that down there. And then take your little UV torch and cure it before you do anything else. That's the benefit of using a UV glue over a super glue, as it will be nice and done whilst you're tying. And that's all done, and we're going to add in our thorax now. So I want a little bit of a hot spot in this particular fly. So I've taken the hen's micro flash 94, so a hot orange, got a little bit of a UV fleck, but a tiny amount. I only want to put sort of 1.5, 2 turns just in that area there. Pull out some of those fibres that I don't want. And now I'm going to take the micro flash again, this time 435, which is a black, slightly more, because this is going to add the bulk of the thorax. And then, as with all of them, make sure that the bead doesn't turn. Wind down and take our whip finish tool and just tighten that down. That little glint of orange, like with the pheasant tail, can be a fantastic sighter for just convincing the fish that your fly is the right thing to take. Really durable. That little perfect quill nymph sinks quickly, gets down, and is perfect for lots of different river situations. Alright, fly number 4, and this is the black and purple. This is an absolute favourite of mine. It's also a favourite for grayling fishing, if you want a good all-purpose nymph, but is really effective for early season trout in particular, I find. So hook, we've got the Partridge SUJ jig hook, jig style. This is a size 16, and it's taken a 3mm slotted tungsten bead in silver. Thread, we've got the Semperfly Nano Silk in black. And we're just going to start that behind the bead and trap that on there. And just nip out the tag end that we don't need anymore. Now take our thread all the way down the straight part of the shank to the back of the fly there, where we're going to tie in our Cote de Lion tail. Again, another 4 fibres will do this fly perfectly. So, let those out, keep those tag ends in line, and again about the body length. So pair it up against the hook, take your thread up through and throw a loop, and just slide that down on top of the shank there and trap those in. Wind that forward, doesn't need to be touching turns in this one. Trim that off. Then we're going to take our rib material. This is Semperfly wire in silver and 0.2mm. So normally a fly this size I would use the 0.1, but we're using this wire as a quite key element of grabbing the fish's attention, essentially. So to do this sort of slotted bead, pipe the wire into the slot, unwind it, and as with that, will place it more on top of the shank of the hook, so keep it there. Don't try and force it round the hook, because that will just create unwanted bulk in different areas then. And then dubbing, we've got the Semperfly Superfine dubbing, and we're just going to use it in black. And for any of you that have used this, you'll know that it's quite a long fibre. So what I do is take a reasonable amount and actually tear it apart to create a much smaller fibre dubbing. Being super fine, it dubs really nicely. Dub just a small amount at the top and bind that to the hook, and then you can begin to work up a long noodle like piece of dubbing that gets thicker as it gets forward. Bind that down, and now we're looking to create that taper up towards the bead. It will taper up quite quickly. And we want to leave a bit of space at the front, which is where we're going to add in our thorax. And then take our rib in the same direction as the dubbing, just opening little segments as we go. And then take our thread over it and in front and twist until it breaks off there. So there we've got our body, everything in position. Nice thing with a slotted bead, even if you under-tie it, it's not moving anywhere. So we're not having to build up bulk like you do with a countersunk bead. Thorax, this is the absolute must if you're tying a black and purple, and it's the Hen's Micro Flash number 17. You can do similar blends yourself, but this one seems to work really nicely. And you'll just take a small amount and bind it to the thread there and get that locking, one turn locking in place, and then build in your additional turns on top. Compared to a lot of other flies, you can afford to make the thorax quite sizable on this, because it is a really key fish catching element to this particular fly. And then once that's all secure, you don't want to build up too much thread work, because you don't want a black spot in front of the dubbing as such. So just go in with your whip finish tool and allow that thread to cut in between the thorax and the bead. and then in with your scissors, nip that out, and you have a wonderful early season nymph pattern, the black and purple, terrific for all water conditions, and should definitely have a spot on any nymphing setup you have, whether fishing duo, single nymph, or a multi-fly, multi-nymph setup. So now moving on to the final fly of the video, we're going to tie the CDC French Nymph. So this is a wonderful adaptation of the French Nymph, which has that wonderful little red hot spot at the back, and it's just a sort of almost an improvement and adaptation to make it move a little bit more in the water, offer a bit more enticing nature to it, so you can convince that trout to take your offering. Great thing is it works nicely in bigger sizes, so if you're faced with a big river early season, you can tie these up into sort of size 10, size 12. You could go into 8s if you wanted to, but this one here is a Partridge SUJ size 14, and it's a 3.5mm slotted bead in silver. Thread, we're sticking with our Semperfli Nano Silk in black, and we're just going to start behind the bead there and lay our thread bases. So what's important to note with this fly is the thread is also the body, so quite a lot of the work we do from the beginning is all going towards the end product of the fly. So bind this down along to the end of the shank, where we're going to add in our Coq de Leon for the tail. It's time to take a couple more fibres than normal, so you can, for this bigger size, you can go 5 or 6 fibres now, because you want it to stand out against a slightly bigger fly. So, but again, you're looking for about the body length. Pair that up against the hook, throw your loop into your thumb and forefinger and just slide it down on top of the shank. There, and then try and do touching turns if your thread will allow you, to bind that all going forward all the way up to the bead. And trim that out. Now I'm just going to add in my rib. So the rib is the silver wire in 0.2mm. And we trap that in. Oh, actually, I'll scrap that. Getting ahead of myself. So we're going to do our little hot spot at the back now, which is red holographic tinsel. And we'll grab off a small section of this. Pop that back. And put that out there. So tie this in near the bead and touching turns as best as possible, as you don't want any of that red shining out through, all the way back to the tail, and take your thread forward, a couple of big open turns just to get it out of the way, and we'll put 1, 2, as we come up for the third we'll just unwind those big turns. We're going to take our thread over the top, each turn just taking it 1 touching turn further forward, and cut that out. That's all that little hot spot needs to be. It doesn't need to be any bigger than that. And now take our thread forward again. And now we're going to tie in our silver wire at 0.2mm. And we'll tuck it into the bead. Try and get it on the side of the shank on these bigger ones. And again, touching turns to try and mask some of that. Okay. Mask all that wire. Now we're just going to do a bit of thread work to create a little bit more of a taper in the body. Doesn't need to be too much because we want this fly to sink quickly. So the thinner the profile, the quicker it will sink. Take that back down. Now we're going to do one forward, touching turns, and that's our body ready. And we're going to take our silver wire in nice open segments going forward and then up near the bead, and then just twist it until it breaks off. There we go. And now we're going to work on the thorax. So this is the CDC part of it, where we're going to give it a CDC wing. So we've got a natural CDC feather here, and we're going to remove some of these long straggly sections down at the bottom so they don't get in our way, and then stroke the fibres backward so you're just left with the tip section. And we're going to tie it in with the outside of the feather facing towards us and the tip facing forward, and trap it down. It will naturally want to go in that groove in the bead, which is fine. Stroke the tip backwards now, and that just means that the feather's locked in place and not going to go anywhere. But then remove the tip without cutting any of the important fibres off the feather. Grab your hackle pliers and clip it onto the tag of the CDC feather. Stroke those long CDC fibres backwards and take it round like any normal hackle. Then you'll probably want to do it 1.5 times there. So up, and then take your thread over the top and again, and then in front of that put quite a few binding turns. We don't want anything to go anywhere, and then just cut out the tag of the CDC that we no longer need, and that's given us a nice pulsating thorax wing. Tidy up that element, and we can, I like to clip the CDC just towards the same length as the tail, and then we're going to take our hen's micro flash in number 435, so black, nice black sparkly dubbing, just a pinch of it, and bind that on. Lost a few fibres there. Get a little bit more. And this is going to be our little bit, helps tidy up where we cut the CDC out. And it just finishes off our CDC French Nymph. Sinks really quickly, really effective, particularly early season, where that little red hot spot can shine out in potentially coloured water. And go in with the whip finish between the thorax and bead. Make sure everything's tight and trim the thread out. And there you have it. That's fly number 5 of a terrific early trout season selection of nymphs that I'm sure will bring you a lot of success. Thank you for tuning in. Please join for another fly tying session in a couple of weeks' time, and I do hope that we all bump into each other on the water soon. Thank you.